Greetings to everyone, friends. The Central Election Commission urges Ukrainians abroad to update their voting address. And now the trust in state institutions is so low that this is perceived with maximum suspicion. And it's unclear how this information will actually be used against those same Ukrainians who are abroad. We'll break all of this down today. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends. Thank you, as always, to each of you. In recent weeks, there has been more and more talk about holding elections. This is primarily related to the political crisis that is currently unfolding in the Verkhovna Rada, when many members of parliament of Ukraine want to give up their mandates altogether. But again, they can't do this because there aren't enough votes for it. At the same time, they don't vote for the bills that come from the cabinet of ministers because they don't think it's necessary to just follow the lead of the cabinet or the president's office. And it is against this background that talks began about the possibility that elections might actually be held even during the war. And in this context, the Central Election Commission is calling on Ukrainians abroad to update their voting address. And here there are two options. First, that they really do want to update this information, and we'll talk about that now. And second, well, for example, that's what immediately came to my mind. The question arose, what if these addresses? And in general, this information might later be used for some other purposes, for example, to search for men liable for military service who are abroad, so that later they can communicate with the politicians of those countries to somehow facilitate the return of these Ukrainians back home in order to mobilize them and send them to the front. I think I'm not the only one who immediately has this question. And this shows the depth of the problems in Ukrainian society right now, and the level of distrust that actually exists towards the current institutions. Because there have probably already been too many statements and various promises made, which were then either used against Ukrainians or simply blatantly broken. And if we are talking specifically about Ukrainians abroad, then the first major breakdown in trust happened recently. Actually, the signing and entry into force of the Mobilization law, yes, which happened back in the spring of 2024. When, at first, for several months before that, they said that Ukrainians who are abroad would not have their consular services restricted. They kept saying they wouldn't, and then just at the last moment before the vote and before the signing, they actually decided to restrict consular services for those not registered for military service or who haven't updated their registration data. And not only that, when people who are abroad rush to quickly submit their documents for passports. On April 25, 2024, that is, 2 weeks before this mobilization law comes into force. There was a separate order at that time from the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha, an order to all consulates, embassies, and the state enterprise document to prohibit and somehow facilitate the non-issuance of passports and to refuse to accept documents for men of conscription age. And that's when all the trust collapsed, because they promised not to restrict consular services, but then they did, and that's when there was quite a panic. And it was after this that the trust of Ukrainians living abroad in the Ukrainian authorities began to plummet, because they realized that any kind of statements could be made. It may all look very nice, but you have to look at the actions, and the actions did not correspond to the interests of Ukrainians abroad. That is why now this information with calls to update your addresses if you live abroad is already being met with hostility. Because no one knows whether later it will somehow be used against Ukrainians who provide their addresses. Yes, it is reported that the creation of additional polling stations abroad is directly related to how many citizens declare in advance their desire to vote. Let's be honest, we need to clearly say either we are holding elections or we are carrying out a total mobilization right now. And this information can actually be used against these people. The Central Election Commission urges Ukrainians abroad to actively update their voting address. This can be done online in the state voter register, and then this voter register can be handed over, I don't know, to the control of the Oberig register. Yes, then the Central Election Commission can use this data as they wish. We've seen this happen before. Actually, it was Viktoria Hlushchenko, a member of the Central Election Commission, who announced this update of addresses abroad at the forum of the civic network Opora. The key challenges of electoral democracy after the Great War. That's what the ELK correspondent reports. In our opinion, the most effective measure to ensure voting rights would be the active registration of voters abroad. And depending on how effectively we can communicate with voters, how well we can ensure universal suffrage, everything will depend on that. She also explained that the creation of additional polling stations abroad is directly related to how many citizens declare in advance their desire to vote. According to her, it is extremely important to convey to every voter the need for active registration, as this will determine how accurately the voter list will be formed at this polling station in the future. That's how it's reported, but in general, at the same time, some politicians in Ukraine claim that there will be no elections in 2026, and if there are no elections in 2026, then why should anyone go now and reveal their personal information? For Ukrainian registries, the question is still open, right? If someone wants mass registration of Ukrainians abroad at polling stations, then probably to begin with, it's necessary to officially announce a clear election date, so that people know why they need to do it. Right now, nobody really wants to just go and update their information, spend time on it, and reveal their address for no reason. First of all, because of the lack of trust, since certain government institutions have discredited themselves so much that no one trusts them anymore. The attitude toward them isn't much better than towards scammers who call and demand personal card data or bank passwords. That's my personal opinion. It might be different from yours, let's put it that way. Despite the fact that the electronic services of the state voter register are already available and citizens can change their voting address online, current activity remains low. Hlushchenko stated that the number of people who have already taken advantage of this opportunity is still insignificant. As she says, unfortunately, the number of people who have already done this is insignificant. It's not even in the thousands. Therefore, it would be good for voters to start changing their voting address now, so I invite all voters to change their voting address and update their information. And in this way, help not only the Central Election Commission, but also the state as a whole. Ukraine needs to organize elections according to international standards. We see now, in my opinion, this is simply using the topic of elections to collect and update data from people who do not want to provide this information. And in fact, it's very clear if this system has been working for some time, there aren't even thousands of people who have updated this data. This clearly shows the level of distrust towards what is happening now. And in my opinion, until there is a specific date for the elections, until the official preparations begin at the legislative level, until there are concrete dates, no one will massively update anything, because there's simply no point, because right now everyone can be made to update their data. And then what? And then they'll say that we're at war, there won't be elections in 2026, then they'll say there won't be elections in 2027, and then they'll say there won't be any in 2028 either. Then the question is, why should anyone give away their personal data, which could later be used against people in some way? Yes, statements also regarding the elections. And regarding Ukrainians abroad, it was reported by the State Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Oleksandr Karasevich. He stated that organizing elections abroad requires at least 6 months and changes to the legislation. You know, this is a very interesting question, because it's the same question. Why not first change the legislation and prepare everything for the elections, and only then demand something from people to update or not update something? Also, there was another statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who also explained that the right of Ukrainian citizens to participate in elections abroad does not depend on whether they are registered with the consulate. Consular registration is an administrative procedure for which a fee of $20 or 18 euros is charged for registration for those who need it. And we understand that nobody needs it right now. So, the bottom line is very simple. There is a very strong loss of trust among Ukrainians abroad towards state institutions. We see that even when Ukrainians abroad have some problems, first of all, the consulate or embassy is not really in a hurry to help them. That's first. And secondly, there is simply no trust. And that's why, even when they want to reach out, they don't. They just go to the police, they look for some alternative ways to solve their problems, and they don't turn to the consulate or the embassy. because they understand that it could just be a waste of time. That's the kind of situation we have with the elections. Write in the comments whether you will urgently update your voting addresses and reveal your new personal data for the voter registry. With the election date still unknown, what are your thoughts? Share in the comments. Thanks and see you next time.